Social media, YouTube and Facebook to Greatest Generation Live. We're going to get the music started. We're going to let everybody in. Thanks for joining us this evening. Let's see here. There we go. Hello. Good evening, everyone. Good evening. Welcome to Greatest Generation Live for Thursday, February 12th. My name is Sean Hall. I'm the Director of Programming with the Veterans Breakfast Club. It's great to see you all here this evening. We've got a great show lined up for you about World War II and the Aleutians. We'll get to that in just a minute, but I want to say hi to main host, the man flying the plane, Glenn Flickinger. Glenn, how are you?
Oh, I'm nervous now. I thought I was co-host. Now that I'm the main host, I don't know. I need something to calm my nerves. But
sweaty palms. Thank you all for joining us. I see some new names in the room with us. It's always great to see new people joining us here on Greatest Generation Live. We are the Veterans Breakfast Club. Our mission is to create communities of listening around veterans and their stories, to connect, educate, heal, and inspire. We've been doing this since 2008. We do that not only through these online programs, but also at our in-person breakfasts. We also have a free quarterly magazine, a new one that's going to be hitting mail boxes very soon. So we'll get into that a little bit later, but please check us out on our website, veteransbreakfastclub.org. It's the best place to find out everything there is to know about us, upcoming programming. All of our past programs are on our website. Even our magazine is online. We have a great blog with tons of information about anything military you can think of. But otherwise, I'll chime back in a little bit later. Let's get to the program. Glenn.
Okay, thank you, Sean. Welcome, everybody. Another Thursday night, another World War II history lesson. Something a little different tonight. We've been trying to find topics that we've not covered in the past, topics that are not well known about World War II. Last week, of course, was the Nuremberg Trials, which is rather well known, just maybe not as known as in depth as we went into last week with that great guest, John Barrett. We have another great guest tonight, Allen Frazier. Allen, please say hello to everybody. Is he unmuted?
Oh, Allen, let me find you. We'll find you. I'll ask you to unmute.
I got him.
There we go.
Sorry about that. Hello, everyone. Nice to see y'all are here today.
Allen, thanks very much for joining us. I'll tell the story about how we got in touch with each other in a little bit. But before we go there, let me say hello to Russell Freeberg. Is Russell? I thought I saw that Russell was there. He is. Russell, let me unmute you. If you could hit the unmute button, Russell. There you go, Russ. How you feeling today?
I'm fine.
You're
Cold.
It's cold.
I'm a little hoarse.
You have a cold. Okay. Okay. Well, welcome. For those of you who maybe don't know Russell Freeberg, Russell is one of the few World War II veterans that we still get to join us online on occasion. Russell's a pretty frequent contributor, and we're really happy to have him on. Russell will be 103 years old on March the 4th. And Russell, Scott Masters, and I are planning your birthday party online that night. Scott, are you with us tonight, Scott? There you are. Let me unmute Scott.
Hi, Glenn. Hi, Russell.
Good evening, Scott.
Scott originally introduced us to Russell a year or more ago when we first had Russell on to tell his World War II story. And so Scott hopefully is going to help me a little bit with what we're planning for the birthday party. Can you bake a cake, Scott? Are you good at cakes?
I think that's the job of the pilot, if I remember what Sean called you before.
He calls me lots of things, but it hasn't been pilot yet. But Russell, pleasure to have you on. Thank you very much for being on tonight. And I got a little surprise for you a little bit here in just a couple of minutes when we talk a little bit more with Allen. So, Allen, what is your background?
Sure. So I write for military.com currently. I'm a journalist and mainly historian. That's probably more so what I focus on. I definitely write the history articles for military.com with a focus on World War II. But of course, I also write about other conflicts as well and do interviews with veterans, especially ones that fought in Vietnam. But I've also interviewed plenty of World War II veterans, a couple Korean War veterans, a couple Global War on Terror veterans as well. I'm also an Army veteran, and I was stationed at Fort Wainwright, Alaska, with the 25th Infantry Division back when I was in. So a lot of what I'm going to talk about today, I've experienced, especially the weather side of things.
Yeah, yeah. And somebody sent me this article you wrote on the Battle of the Aleutian Islands from military.com 2 or 3 months ago. And when I read it, I instantly thought, yes, I have to meet Alan because, I other than I know there was a battle there, I know the Japanese invaded it just about the same time as the Battle of Midway. I've never known the details of it. So qualified instantly for what we're looking for, something that is not so over told as many of the stories are. We can only fight Iwo Jima and the Battle of the Bulge so many times, and we need to recognize these men that sacrificed in so many places that we've kind of forgotten about. So, so here's my little surprise because I was just fascinated by Alan's background. I'm going to show you a picture of what Alan used to be involved with in the military. Okay, did that come up okay?
It did.
Alan, what are we looking at?
So that there is a Striker, one of our, or the Army's armored personnel carriers. There's several different variants. That looks like, I think it says, yep, the M1126. So that's the infantry carrier one with the 50 cal on top. I saw someone in the chat ask what MOS I was. I was a cavalry scout. So our Striker had either a 50 caliber machine gun or Mark 19 up top, but it also had a huge box on top for reconnaissance where we could actually lace targets and call for artillery on it. And that variant was the M1127. And yes, I do have a Stetson somewhere in my room.
I just think it's super cool to say I was in the cavalry. I mean,
I love doing that.
it would seem like where's my horse and where's my Stetson, right?
Exactly.
Did you drive one of these things or what?
I did, yeah. So I had to go to a course after I graduated from basic training to learn how to be a crew member on these. And then usually when you first get to the unit, you're a driver on one of these. And then if you, sorry, I have a couple of dogs that are going to kind of bug me, but they'll usually after a while, they'll probably make you a dismount if there's not a slot for you to be a gunner. But once you learn the ropes, you'll become a gunner and you're actually up top manning the machine gun.
Yeah, I tell you, it's a really fascinating looking vehicle. And my little surprise for Russ, hopefully, Russ, you're still unmuted. Yeah. So compare that Striker to more or less, I think, Russ, this is what you drove around Europe in 1944 and 5. Is that right? Something close to that?
That's right. The vehicle you just showed is much more sophisticated than a half track.
Much more so, but it's like the great granddaddy of the Striker, right?
Yeah, probably.
Yeah, yeah. So, and you certainly went through some cold weather as well, right?
Yeah, we did, and that was a very cold winter in 44, 45 in Europe, and a lot of snow, and it was quite high, knee high in some places and higher. But we tried to get into buildings as much as possible and have heat uh, available.
Sure.
Of course, we could always sit on the engine of the half track, which was always hot and warm.
Yeah. And just like the Striker, this came in different models. All right. This looks like some sort of almost 50 millimeter quad weapon on the back of this half track, maybe anti-aircraft, something like that. Uh, so yeah, great granddaddy of the Striker.
Definitely is.
One last question for you. Was the Striker air conditioned?
It does have fans inside. I never used that in Alaska ever, from what I remember. But it stays somewhat warm in there. Just once you have 10 people piled into the back, it just naturally does.
Yeah.
But there's no getting away from the cold in Alaska, no matter what.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, anyway, I just think it's interesting here. Two men separated by probably 2 or 3 generations with very similar Army experiences. Alan, I don't recall there being any battles in Alaska in the 2000s, but still very similar experiences in these kind of vehicles. Okay, so let's get to the main show here. Alan has prepared just an excellent PowerPoint presentation. And as we normally do, we'll follow this PowerPoint. We'll stop now and then to get questions from the audience. Please use the chat as much as you can. Okay. So, Alan, I'm going to turn this over to you.
Okay, yeah. So I'm happy to talk about this. Just even when I was stationed at Fort Wainwright in Fairbanks, I was 18. I didn't know a lot. I definitely didn't have the education or experience I do now, but it was fascinating to me to learn that there is a ton of World War II history in Alaska. The airfield on Fort Wainwright, Ladd Army Airfield, was built as part of the Lend-Lease program to get planes to the Soviet Union. So that was the first time I ever learned about any of this. I think I had heard in passing there was a battle in Alaska during World War II. Never the details. Never knew any of this in this presentation until relatively recently. In fact, it wasn't until a couple months ago when I researched and wrote the story for military.com, which one of the unfortunate things with writing for an online publication, I can't get everything in there that I would want to. But I learned a lot about it. And one thing I actually received a lot of questions about, which is why I start with this in this presentation, was can you really call it U.S. soil when it was not a U.S. state at the time Japan landed on Attu and Kiska? And yes, it was U.S. soil. So Alaska was purchased in 1867. It was a frozen wasteland. A lot of people were not happy with Seward when he bought this from Russia. It was just a lot of nothing, a lot of snow. It was a military district for a while before people started finding gold. People started finding there were a lot of furs and a lot of resources in Alaska. Thousands of people started moving there. So by 1884, they passed the first Organic Act, which organized the District of Alaska. This gave Alaska its first sense of civilization, its first laws, customs, and it borrowed a lot of it from Oregon, actually. And over the next 30 years, Alaska's population boomed. A lot of Americans started moving there. People were carving out land, building cabins and cities. And then in 1912, the second Organic Act created the Incorporated Territory of Alaska, which is what it was throughout World War II. So everything we're going to talk about later on, Alaska was an incorporated territory of the United States. And if you don't know the difference between an incorporated territory and an unincorporated territory, incorporated means the Constitution applies to the land, including the Bill of Rights. The people that live there are American citizens, if they weren't already, and anyone that is born there is an American citizen. So after this act was passed, the people there became American if they weren't already. And the natives that lived there, like the ones we're going to talk about, were now managed and overseen by the Bureau of Indian Affairs. So for all intents and purposes, Alaska was U.S. soil, just not a state yet. A lot of people said, well, Japan also invaded Guam or Wake Island or the Philippines. Is that not U.S. soil? They were not incorporated. They were unincorporated. The people on those islands were not American citizens. There were no Americans on Wake anyway, no civilians anyways. The Philippines was its own country for the most part by that time. But Guam is still to this day unincorporated. The Chamorro people that inhabit Guam actually did not become American citizens until separate legislation was passed in 1950 that made them American citizens, but Guam is still not incorporated. But even as far back as 1916, there were efforts to make Alaska a state. It was on its way to statehood. Most people in the US, from politicians, the president, all the way down to your average citizen, knew Alaska was going to be a state at some point. It was on North American soil. It was part of the continent itself. People were moving there. Everyone looked at it as the next state. It's going to happen eventually. But of course, the Great Depression. Oh, I'm sorry.
When was the Alaskan gold rush?
So that would have been towards the late 1800s, 1890s. So once the California gold deposits started clearing up, everybody found all the gold. Alaska was the next spot. That's where everybody started going to next. And you can still find plenty of gold in some parts of Alaska.
Okay.
But yeah, so the population was actually around 58,000 in 1916, which is when the first statehood bill was introduced. There's no set rigid structure for how many people need to live there for it to be a state. But most people in Congress felt that just wasn't enough. They knew it would happen, and a lot of politicians wanted it to happen because it would either be 2 more senators for the Democrats or 2 more senators for the Republicans.
Yeah.
So everyone knew, but the Great Depression and then eventually World War II, it just got put on the back burner. But to your average American during World War II, when Japan landed on these islands, your average American looked at it as they took American soil. And the Japanese, too, put it in their propaganda, we invaded America.
Which was kind of part of their reasoning for doing this, is to be able to make that statement.
Yes, and I'll talk about that in a second, but that was part of it. And then Attu itself, the only land battle that actually occurred on American soil during World War II, it's the only battle of the American theater. So this battle and the campaign overall falls under the Pacific theater at the highest level, but because it's occurring on North American soil, it's actually part of the American theater, which a lot of people tend to forget is an actual military theater. There were casualties, there were campaigns, there were patrols, there were bombings. The Japanese submarine shelled California. The Japanese pilot took off from a submarine and bombed Oregon. Japan launched balloon bombs, which reached as far as Nebraska, if I remember correctly, killed several civilians. German submarines sank ships in the Gulf of Mexico, off Florida. Even Italy was actually planning an attack on New York before they capitulated, and that's the only reason it stopped. So it was, by all accounts, a campaign or a theater of war, just few battles. Attu is the only pitched battle between Japanese or any Axis force and American forces during the war. And there's other things that make it unique as well. It's the only battle in the Pacific where US and Japanese forces engaged each other in snow in Arctic conditions. Normally, when you think of the Pacific War, you imagine Marines storming the beach, soldiers moving into the jungle, Japanese troops ambushing them in the jungle. But Attu was not like that. It was frozen. It was in the mountains. There was snow. Japanese and American soldiers were wearing big, heavy parkas and snowshoes. It's very fascinating. But just to get, so when we're talking about the Aleutian Islands campaign through the rest of this map will help give some idea of where all of this is taking place. So the Aleutian Islands actually stretch over 1,200 miles from mainland Alaska to, I believe it's 2 or 5 miles, somewhere in there, to Russia. Big and Little Diomede Islands are this close to each other. You can actually walk from Russia to the US at this location when it freezes over. So it's massive. This is a massive, when I'm talking about the Aleutian Islands campaign, it's over 1,200 miles of front line. And it's over 300 islands, most of which are uninhabited. There are some locals, the Uningak. I probably butchered that. I always do every time I try to say it. But they're known as the Aleuts. That's their native term for coastal people. And they had inhabited these islands for 10,000 years. They had been there ever since the first people crossed over the Bering land bridge back then. Russia, of course, colonized Alaska in the late 1700s, and their population, unfortunately, took a huge hit. So even today, there's only about 6,000 Aleuts or people descended from that population today. At this time, there were barely 1,000.
So there were Aleuts living on Attu Island at the time of the Japanese invasion.
Yes, most of them lived around Dutch Harbor and then east, but there were some on Attu and a couple other islands. There were none on Kiska, though. That's one of the other islands we'll talk about. But there were some on Attu. I saved most of the information about what happens to them towards the end because I think it's the most important thing that you could learn about when it comes to this battle and this campaign.
Yeah.
But yes, there were about 1,000 of them.
So other than the propaganda value of saying we've invaded the United States, why in the world did the Japanese bother sending any forces to invade Attu and Kiska?
Well, there's several reasons. There's definitely the propaganda piece. They wanted to go ahead and say, look at this, we invaded America. And that is probably the cheapest shot they could take. Japan also had this notion, all the Axis powers did this for the most part, that if you just do this one thing, everything will fall into place afterwards and we'll win the war. That's just how it works. So they not only felt it's a huge propaganda victory, but they also felt if we take Attu, after, a couple months after we just bombed Pearl Harbor and mauled the Pacific Fleet, and maybe if we destroy the U.S. carrier fleet at the same time we invade Alaska, America might just say, you got us, we give up. Of course, like almost every other battle of World War II after 1941, that's not what happened. So part of it was Japan recognized Alaska has tons of resources. It's also a great staging area if you were to attack either the U.S. West Coast or even if you're in a war with the Soviet Union. This is a strategic area. But even before the U.S. and Japan went to war, the U.S. is sending Lend-Lease supplies through Alaska to the Soviet Union. It's mainly airplanes, but if they could build a base in some of the Aleutian Islands, they could potentially interdict some of these planes, or they could station submarines there and actually go and hit Anchorage, or strike the West Coast, or bomb Dutch Harbor, which is one of the main logistics hubs of American supplies going west towards the Soviet Union. So like I said, even Fort Wainwright, its origins was part of the Lend-Lease program. So there is a military presence in Alaska, not a major one per se, but Japan recognizes it.
Yeah.
And then, of course, there's resources and things like that, too. If Japan could invade all of Alaska, they absolutely would have wanted to. And it's fascinating, too, of the Axis powers, Japan was the only one that outright publicly did talk about world domination and documented how they would go about controlling the world. There's a book called Rising Sun Victorious. I can't remember the author, but he actually wrote this book kind of in the viewpoint of if Japan had won the war. But he uses primary source documents throughout it to say, once we take Alaska, we're going to rename it the Imperial State of Alaska or things like that. And it's actual writing from Japanese leaders of the time. And it went as far as Jamaica. They were saying, once we take Jamaica, this is what we'll rename it. This is how we'll fit it into the larger picture. So even before Pearl Harbor, Japan wanted to invade Alaska to some extent, but they also wanted to invade California as well. Yeah. But the main reason they end up doing so, because after Pearl Harbor, they had no real capability or desire to send a force north, but they did think it would help secure their northern flank. Because if you look from Attu to mainland Japan, there's nothing really there. So if the U.S. decided to send forces through the Aleutians, they could strike Japan relatively easily. However, the Pacific falls under the Imperial Japanese Navy's domain. So they're the ones coming up with all of these operations. They're the ones deciding to duke it out in the Solomon Islands. They're the ones that decided on attacking Pearl Harbor. And they come up with this audacious plan most of you have probably heard of to wipe out the U.S. carrier fleet at Midway. Right. So in June of 1942, they're planning on going towards Midway. They want to ambush the U.S. carrier fleet, but they feel the best way to go about it is to send a distraction force to the Aleutians. If they attack Dutch Harbor, take over some of the Aleutian Islands, and land some troops there, sorry about my dog, but that the U.S. might actually send some of its carrier fleet up towards the Aleutians instead, and it'll just be easy pickings. Yeah. The Army, though, which is concerned with the fighting in China and mainland Asia, does not want anything to do with this. They're already holding what they can in the Pacific. They're not interested in wasting lives in Alaska. They have bigger fish to fry. But on April 18th of 1942, the famous Doolittle raid strikes Tokyo. US B-25s launching from an aircraft carrier hit Japan, completely shattered Japanese feelings of invincibility, and the Japanese public are questioning, how could our leadership let this happen? So the Army turns around and says, you know what? I think our best bet to get payback is to invade Alaska. So it kind of works out for the Army and the Navy.
Yeah.
It's
one of those unintended consequences of history that is so fascinating. The Doolittle raid, which was, our propaganda statement that we could bomb Japan because it really didn't do anything strategically significant to the Japanese islands. But the unintended consequence was the Japanese are so embarrassed by it, and the internal politics work such that they say, okay, we're going to invade, we're going to try to take Midway. And at the same time, this diversionary attack on the Aleutian Islands. Yeah.
That's right. It ends up coming down to diversionary propaganda, a mix of the two. Those are the main reasons they decided to conduct this operation.
Right. So, in fact, even as the Battle of Midway is raging, the Japanese bombed Dutch Harbor, and there were American facilities there. There were American troops on Dutch Harbor. That's
right. And so Dutch Harbor, as I mentioned, was the main logistics hub for American Lend-Lease and for Alaska Defense Command. It's a huge base, and Japan recognized this, and they sent a task force, Japanese Fifth Fleet, which has 2 aircraft carriers, to Dutch Harbor under Vice Admiral Boshiro Hosagaya. And he actually launches the first raid on Dutch Harbor on June 3rd, in the morning of June 3rd. However, the weather is really rough. The wind is really rough. It's super cloudy. So some of the squadrons of planes, especially the dive bombers, actually turn around halfway to Dutch Harbor and say, there's no point. We're either going to miss our targets and waste ammo, or we're going to crash while trying to dive bomb the island. So they turn around. A force of 23 bombers, however, does actually make it to Dutch Harbor and bombs it. They cause very little damage on this raid. It's more of a shock that the Americans knew Japan was up to something. They didn't expect them to bomb Dutch Harbor. And even when you look at the painting here, it looks, if you were to show this to me and I don't know the context, I would almost assume that's Pearl Harbor.
Yeah.
Kind of the same strategy there. Their goal was to hopefully impede the expected American counterattack through the Aleutians. But they ran into a problem while they were conducting this raid. A couple of American PBY reconnaissance planes actually spot the Japanese fleet and try to transmit back to Dutch Harbor like, hey, the aircraft carriers are here. We found them. However, they are shot down in the process, and the radio transmissions at some point were lost either in transit, or they didn't make it, or someone wasn't monitoring the radio. The U.S. does not pick up on where the carriers are. So Hosagaya, after the raid, turns his fleet west to go support the landings. But that night, he's thinking to himself and says, that raid was really ineffectual. We did not cause any real damage. Most of the planes did not actually conduct the bombings. I feel we could have done much better. So he actually stops the fleet and launches a second attack the following morning. This one, all of the planes make it. It's much more devastating, a lot heavier. They actually end up killing 43 Americans and wound dozens more. They sink a ship in the harbor. They destroy several B-17s and PBYs on the ground at an airfield, and they hit the oil facilities, barracks. It's, in the grand scheme of things, it's not a huge victory for Japan at all. It actually did not impede the U.S. whatsoever going forward, but it did cause some damage. But in the process, they also got intercepted by several American P-40 Warhawks from some surrounding airfields on islands that Japan was not tracking. One Japanese Zero is actually shot down during this bombing and lands on Akutan Island mostly intact. The U.S. actually managed to recover that Zero and was able to take it to a testing facility, examined it, learned the Zero's capabilities, and that's what led to advanced fighters later on, such as the Hellcat, that were more than capable of taking the Zero on in combat. And even worse, too, Japan wanted this to be a diversionary attack while the ongoing Battle of Midway is occurring. So after the second raid, once the squadrons get back to the carriers, Isoroku Yamamoto, who's leading the Japanese carriers at Midway, actually orders Hosagaya to head south to support him at Midway. Before he could even really get underway to go support the fleet at Midway, he receives another message from Yamamoto that says, "Don't bother. This battle's over, and there's nothing you can do. It's done." Yeah. Japan lost most of its carriers at Midway. The survivors fled back to Japan. He ordered Hosagaya to get out of the Aleutians and take his carriers back.
Another great counterfactual question would be: had those two carriers that the Japanese sent to the Aleutian Islands, had they been in the Battle of Midway, would it have been made any difference? Would those two carriers have, survived and hit our carriers? Would it change the outcome of the battle in any way? Of course, I'm happy it didn't. But you can play those mind games all day long.
That's one of those things people always ask me whenever I publish a history story is, if the Axis had won this battle or done this, would it have changed the outcome of the war, or could they have maybe done this or X, Y, Z? And the short answer for all of it is no, it would have changed. Even if they had won Midway, they were going to lose their carriers in a battle a couple months later. I have no doubt about it. They were going to lose the war.
The time frames involved might have been a little different, is about the extent.
Yep. But anyways, after the bombing of Dutch Harbor, the actual landings in the Aleutian Islands occurs. So on June 6th, Japanese Special Naval Landing Force lands on Kiska Island, which is their main objective. So these are actually Japanese Marines who go ashore. And as I said earlier, there's no Aleut civilians living on Kiska, but there is a small naval weather station on the island. There are 10 sailors posted there. And in the process of the Japanese going ashore, they kill 2 of the sailors, and the rest try to evade capture. One of them is at least one of them was badly wounded. 7 of them were captured. One of them, William C. House, I won't go too far into his experiences, but he actually manages to evade capture initially and goes off into the wilderness of Kiska Island. And he survives on eating snow, drinking water out of frozen creek beds, and actually eating earthworms he can dig out of the ground. Oh. And after 48 days of surviving in the wilderness, he realizes he weighs 80 pounds at this point. And he says, I'm going to die if I stay out here. If I surrender to the Japanese, I might have a chance. So he walks back to the Japanese garrison and surrenders himself. And if you Google William C. House, Kiska Island, the National Park Service has his account published on their website, and it's a really fascinating read. I would encourage all of you to look at it. He actually survived the war, but all of the men were taken as prisoners, and he actually was treated relatively fairly by the Japanese on the island. They actually, when he approached the first AA gun he saw, they actually grabbed him and pulled him in, actually covered him during an American bombing that happened to happen that day, and they ended up giving him food and tea and helped him recover, which is fascinating when you consider how most Allied POWs were treated. But a couple months later, they were pulled off the island and sent to the far reaches of the Japanese Empire as POWs, which some of them did not survive. William C. House and a couple others did. The next day, however, a battalion of Japanese troops from the 301st Independent Infantry Battalion, so about 1,000 men, landed on Attu Island. This is important because there were actually civilians living on Attu. Once the American codebreakers realized Japan's going to move into the Aleutian Islands, they actually offered to remove the civilians from Attu to protect them. And they said, no. They said, we've been here for 10,000 years. We're not leaving now. So as the Japanese go ashore, there are 40 Attuan civilians that live on the island, and there are 2 white Americans that live on the island. Charles Foster Jones is a school teacher with the Bureau of Indian Affairs, and he runs the radio station up on the hill. The Japanese go into the radio station immediately. He destroyed the radio, and they demanded he fix it. And he said no. And the Japanese actually executed him. Oh. He is the only American civilian to be directly killed or executed by Axis soldiers on American soil in the entirety of World War II. The other 40 Attuans and then his wife, Etta Jones, were taken prisoner, and they were held on the island for the next couple months. Interestingly, they were led by Chief Mike Hodakoff, who is the constable mayor, the village leader for the people on this island. When the Japanese were landing, a lot of the civilians, it's Alaska, everyone has guns. They started going to their houses to get their guns and actually try to fight off these 1,000 Japanese troops. And he stopped everyone and said, don't do that. No, they will massacre all of us. So he stopped. And I have no doubt if they had fired at the Japanese, that's exactly what would have happened.
Yeah.
But he stopped it. And I will talk more about the civilians. I saved that for the end just because I feel that's really important. But yeah, just know the Japanese did take 41 civilians prisoner on Attu and executed one.
Yeah. So other than those actions against the civilians and Charles Foster Jones, there's no American military force there. There's no combat that takes place. The Japanese just take the island rather quickly. Yeah.
Yeah. There's no defenders on either. Even the Navy weather station, they tried to run immediately. There was no, and they know it's 10 versus 5,000. The base on Kiska, which is where the Japanese actually headquartered their forces, grew to over 5,000 soldiers, and they had submarines, they had planes stationed at a small airfield there. They had AA guns, and there's even allegedly one Japanese light tank stationed on the island. So the civilians and the sailors were not going to fight that.
And then this internment, that's the Aleuts that lived in the other Aleutian islands. Is that what we're saying here?
That's right. So as soon as Japan landed on those islands, the American government stepped in and actually forcibly relocated over 800 Aleut civilians from all of the other Aleutian islands. Like I said, they were mainly around Dutch Harbor and some of the islands closer towards mainland Alaska. But again, the Americans don't know necessarily if Japan's going to stop at Attu and Kiska. They don't know if maybe Dutch Harbor is going to get invaded.
Yeah.
So it's very, I'll talk about this again towards the end as well, but the American government felt it was best for their safety to remove them from these islands. And they were actually put on mainland Alaska in old refineries, old canneries, these old abandoned factories and buildings that were not the best place ever to live in the middle of the winter in Alaska. 85 of them, of the 800 that were forcibly relocated, actually ended up dying from disease, influenza, just disease. And none of it was intentional by the American government. Like, they did not go in and mistreat them or actively try to do. It was partly to save them from the Japanese.
Sure.
But it was such a violent thing to happen to their culture that a lot of them died over the next couple of years. And making it even worse, the U.S. military wanted to prevent the Japanese from using the buildings and their villages as headquarters or defenses, or they did not want to leave anything for the Japanese. So they actually went and burned their villages down to deny that to the Japanese. So these villages, many of which could trace their roots thousands of years, were gone. They were destroyed.
It's too easy to forget 80 odd years later that the West Coast of America was being heavily defended by many military units, fearing that the Japanese might try an invasion somewhere along the West Coast. So, this was just sort of an extension of that fear.
That's right. So it was actually this removal was done by Lieutenant General John L. DeWitt, who was in charge of the Western Defense Command, which covers all of the West Coast and Alaska. He's the one that actually oversaw the internment of Japanese Americans and several other Germans and Italians to an extent. Even my great-grandfather wasn't interred, but the FBI came to his door and took his radio, his hunting rifle, a lot of his personal stuff, and had restrictions placed on him. It was obviously not as bad in the South, but on the West Coast, these Japanese Americans were removed because they felt the Japanese were about to land on the West Coast. And this is the first step of it. At least, again, Americans aren't fully aware of what just happened at Midway, or understand that Japan doesn't really have the capability to do this, nor even the desire to at the moment.
Yeah.
So they feel the Aleutians were the first step. Dutch Harbor's next, Anchorage is next, West Coast is in the pipeline somewhere. So the internment didn't happen under the Executive Order 9066 like the Japanese American internment did, but it was done by the same commander. And was very similar.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Let's stop here for a minute because I think next we're going to get into it's kind of the first phase of this story we just sort of finished, right?
Right.
And we'll get into now what the Americans do about that. But yeah, the 41, 42, the hysteria, the sort of mass hysteria on the West Coast. If most of us are old enough to remember 9/11 very starkly, right? And the mass hysteria that occurred after that. What was going to happen next? Were they going to terrorists going to bomb, more cities? I can remember a day or two after 9/11 being in downtown Pittsburgh and the USX Tower, which is the tallest building in downtown Pittsburgh, had been evacuated, because they were worried about some sort of terrorist act against the USX Tower in Pittsburgh. I'm sure the same thing happened in many places. And that's what was happening on the West Coast of the United States.
That's right.
So let's pause here and see, Sean, what's in the chat. I've been following it. And if there's any questions or comments that our audience would like to make or ask. Sean, are you there? Oh, I've been left alone. Holy cow. I don't know.
I'm here. Sorry about that. I was talking and realized that when I got kicked off earlier, I came back on and my mic was not on. My apologies. Yes, it's been a lively chat tonight. Thank you, everybody. Chase for putting in the pictures and several people putting in that family members had served. Like Larry Obrist saying his uncle was a chaplain with the 11th Air Force on Amchitka. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. Victor Ramos, his father, was stationed in Attu with the Air Force during the Korean police action. Yes, there's a lot of good stuff in the chat. No questions that I can see, but if I'm missing one because I got kicked off earlier, please feel free to raise your hand like Joe McCarthy just did. We'll ask you to unmute Joe, and you can ask your question.
Alan, I read a article from there was a lieutenant colonel that is based in Alaska that said that the Japanese thought the Doolittle raid originated from the Aleutian Islands. I wanted you to, I didn't know if you heard that or if you could comment on that.
I had read that. They had suspicions. They were fairly certain they knew that the planes came from a carrier because the carrier was actually spotted in the process of launching the planes. So they kind of knew where the Doolittle raid came from, but they were severely concerned that there was a huge gap in their defenses in the Kuril Islands, which are the little Japanese islands going up towards the Kamchatka Peninsula.
Right.
And they knew that if the U.S. military decided to build up their forces on Attu and Kiska, they could launch bombing raids over the Kuril Islands, which I do talk about here in a little bit. But that was a concern of theirs. That is part of the reason they wanted to take those islands specifically.
I read that Kuril Islands were only 700 miles from Japan, mainland Japan. So that would have been pretty close, too close for comfort to have the Americans jump from Attu over to those islands.
That's right. I actually don't know the closest point between, it's definitely Attu. I don't know the exact mileage, but Attu is closer to Tokyo than it is Anchorage. Anchorage is about 1,500 miles from Attu. Tokyo is about 1,200. So,
right.
Yeah, they were aware of that.
I see a comment.
Chase? Oh, go ahead.
Go
Go ahead,
ahead.
Glenn.
Well, I just saw a comment here by James Matsuoka. James, can we get James unmuted?
Sure. Let's see here. While we're getting James unmuted, Chase, you can go ahead.
I just was curious. It's been a while since I've seen the photographs, but are there still wrecks, like rusted hulls of bunkers and tanks and whatnot, still on the islands?
Yes. And what I can say is it was part of the reason I have so many slides in this presentation is because I had so many awesome photos I wanted to show y'all. And it was really hard to pick which ones to include and which ones not to include. But some of them are crashed planes that are still there. There are some barren islands that have a crashed B-17 or I believe C-47 just lying out in the field, rusting to this day. There were several fighter planes, I think for the most part, I think you can still see pieces of them or they were buried. But on Kiska Island especially, there are actually still remnants of Japanese military artifacts. And I do have a photo of one later on that are still, the island is still recognized as a battlefield and it's a national historical marker. So they've left a lot of the bunkers and emplacements there. You can still see them today.
Yeah, I found a really interesting photo of a B-25, I believe. I'm not very good with my bomber markings. Nose down, like in the snow and whatnot, that I thought was pretty cool. As well as the American captured Japanese landing craft.
Yep. So I'm not sure about the landing craft. I'm sure there's something there. There's definitely planes you can still see to this day that are still lying where they crashed.
Yeah. Did we get James unmuted? James, are you available?
I tried to unmute James, but he might not be at his desk.
Ah, okay. Just he had a comment in the chat that he actually tried to visit Attu and Kiska on a battlefield tour, but unfortunately, the boat had to turn back because the captain of the boat had a heart attack. I guess I'm just curious. I was going to ask James, but Alan, you can go visit these islands. There are, as you were talking about with Chase, there are
Yes.
battlefield tours available.
Yes, I have it later on in the presentation. I saved that for the end around the civilian aspect. But yes, you can actually visit these islands. You have to get a permit from the Fish and Wildlife Service, who are more than happy to give you the permit. But getting to these islands is extremely difficult. There's no people that live on these islands to this day. There's not even Coast Guard anymore. They stopped doing that over a decade ago. So you can take float planes there. Not all the way. I think you can take them part of the way, like maybe to Dutch Harbor or one of the other islands. And then you can take a charter boat to Kiska and Attu. A lot of military history tours do go out there. A lot of bird watchers like to go out there. Scientists as well, and environmentalists. But yes, you can visit these battlefields today.
Imagine there's no five-star hotel on the island, so you're roughing it.
Opportunity, Glenn.
Yeah,
Opportunity.
roughing it for me is a two-star hotel.
Yep.
Al Smith also asked in the chat, did the discovery of the Japanese Zero initiate the development of the Hellcat, or was it already in development?
I saw that earlier. I'm not sure that the Hellcat was the direct response to the Zero. I'm not an aviation person for sure. But the Zero that they captured on that island, they took to testing and they studied it. They looked at its capabilities, how they could defeat it, and it did go into the development of future aircraft. I believe the Hellcat is one of them. I interviewed a World War II veteran a couple years ago who was a Hellcat pilot, and I believe he mentioned that captured Japanese aircraft went into the development of it. I'm definitely not the one to say for sure that's what happened, but I believe so.
I saw Barb waving her hand there. Barb, I unmuted you.
Oh,
Yes, thank you. Again, Veterans Breakfast Club, very best chat in the nation. Alan, thank you for coming on, teaching us about information about Alaska. I was conceived in Alaska in Fairbanks in 1955, but my mom had me at a coal mining town of her hometown in Shamokin, Pennsylvania. But anyway, I wanted to invite our buddy who came on that I met about a year ago, Luis Rodriguez. I texted him right away when I saw that Alan was going to be on, and he joined us. So on the screen that we're looking at right now, we probably have Russell Freeberg, the oldest, and Luis Rodriguez, the youngest participant tonight. I think Luis is maybe 17 or 18 years old. A historian in his own right, has interviewed maybe 40 or more World War II veterans by now, including in the chat, you'll see one that participated in the Attu campaign. I lost the chat portion here, but I'd like to welcome Luis back to our Veterans Breakfast Club tonight. So thank you for everybody's participation tonight. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Barb, and thank you for being on, Luis. Thank you very much. I was looking for him in the gallery here. I haven't spotted him yet, but
Bottom row.
bottom row.
Right here.
Oh, there you are. Here, I'll unmute you just so you can say hello. Luis, thank you for being on.
Thank you guys for having me on. I'm very interested in the Aleutian campaign. It's definitely a very forgotten theater, unfortunately, of the Second World War. And I've had the pleasure of speaking with one World War II veteran that was there, a Pearl Harbor survivor who later went on. He was in the Navy and he participated in the bombing, the naval bombardment of Attu. Yeah, it's very interesting, and thank you, Mr. Allen, for taking the time to speak with us.
Yeah, that's awesome. I appreciate that. It's fascinating to hear from people that have some connection or interviewed somebody or know somebody that took part in all of this. I had several people email me after the story was published that said, my dad fought on this island, or my neighbor from 40 years ago fought on this island. And they said, I had no idea about the details of the battle. So actually, learning all of this was fascinating to
Yeah,
kind of piece all the dots together.
very cool.
We're going to jump back into the story here, but we're going to bring Joe McCarthy back in because he had a relative that served in the Aleutian Islands. But Joe, let us make a little progress on the story, and we'll bring you back in after in 15 minutes. Okay, let's jump back in here. So, next phase, the American buildup. What do we do about all this, Alan? What's our reaction?
Right. So when the Japanese actually attacked Dutch Harbor and then landed on Attu and Kiska, there was not a lot the U.S. could do immediately. The Alaska Defense Command, which was all military units based in Alaska, was under the command of Major General Simon Bolivar Buckner Jr., who some of you may have heard about. I'll mention what he's most famous for later on. But he has very few soldiers. There's actually an Alaskan Defense Navy, but it's a couple, maybe 4 old World War I era destroyers that he is not going to send after a couple of Japanese aircraft carriers. It's not going to happen. He's most focused on protecting Dutch Harbor. That's the key, and that's what he does. So they mostly sit static and build up their forces, repair their facilities, and start coming up with their next couple ideas of how to move forward. And at the same time, you got to think too. So after Midway occurred, the Japanese kind of pull back to lick their wounds. They're occupying those islands. The Americans now have a little bit of the initiative in the Pacific, and they're actually going towards Guadalcanal. They're wanting to counterattack in the Solomon Islands. Alaska is not their primary concern. As much of a prideful hit it was to lose those islands to the Japanese, strategically, they're not as important to the Americans as Guadalcanal or the Central Pacific. But that doesn't mean they start sending planes, they start sending naval vessels, they start kind of coming up with the resources and the supplies to launch offensive operations. And one of the most fascinating parts of the Aleutian Islands campaign is Kastner's Cutthroats. So this would be the first Alaskan combat intelligence platoon. So Colonel Lawrence V. Kastner, who graduated from West Point in the early 1920s and was serving in the military, was tasked with forming this unit and actually approaching Alaskan natives. So it was a lot of Aleuts, including Aleuts, whose families were affected by this campaign, as well as other Eskimo and native communities from throughout Alaska, as well as hunters, trappers, fishermen, people that have probably not seen civilization for a few years. And they're tasked with actually leading the reconnaissance and helping the units that are going to go forward to fight the Japanese. One of the first things Kastner's Cutthroats do is they land on Adak Island, which is 250 miles east of Kiska. It's about, I don't want to say halfway, but it's between Kiska and Attu, as well as Dutch Harbor. So they go ashore to actually make sure there's no Japanese on the island, no, reconnaissance parties, no garrisons, no naval vessels hiding in the harbor waiting to ambush the Americans. And once they declare it secure, they go inland and say, this is where you need to build an airfield. This is the best ground on the island. This is the flattest terrain. It's not covered in muskeg or swamp or cragged rocks or anything like that. So now engineers go in and start building this airfield on Adak Island. They did the same thing on Amchitka Island a couple months later in January of 1943. And on a side note, the Japanese are not remaining static throughout this time either. They actually send some forces to neighboring islands. They actually land on Amchitka Island, and they're doing the same thing. They're looking to say, can we build a supply depot here? Can we build an airfield here? Is this harbor good enough to have destroyers or submarines based in it? Could the Americans do the same thing here? Right? So it is kind of a little bit of a back and forth, but the Americans start to have the upper hand. So the 11th Air Force, which I know someone in the chat mentioned they knew somebody that was in the 11th Air Force, actually starts stationing bombers on Adak Island, including B-24s, B-25s, B-26s. They had B-17s initially. I'm not sure if they did much after the initial campaign. And they almost immediately go out and start bombing Kiska and Attu. They drop everything I read was somewhere between 4 to 6 million pounds of ordnance on Kiska alone over the next couple of months. And then they stationed P-38 Lightnings and P-40 Warhawks on Amchitka Island, who actually go out and are doing reconnaissance. They're strafing the Japanese garrisons on Kiska. And they cause casualties. They cause losses. They actually start attacking Japanese naval vessels and sink several of them. And this is part of the reason the Japanese forces on these islands actually took the POWs and the civilians and removed them from the islands and sent them to Japan or the far corners of the Japanese Empire, because they knew the Americans were coming and they didn't want them to rescue the civilians or the POWs. But with that being said, the Japanese on Kiska actually were worried the Americans were going to land very soon. They knew Kiska was the natural target. The Americans knew that's where the Japanese were headquartered. It was the more important island. It was the closest island towards Dutch Harbor. So the Japanese actually pulled all of the soldiers on Attu off of the island to reinforce Kiska. For about a month, there were no Japanese soldiers on Attu. And a lot of people question, why didn't the Americans go and reoccupy the island while there was a chance? And the reasoning for that is there's no American ground combat troops in Alaska yet. If they send a garrison there, there's no one stopping Japan from landing more troops on the island and overrunning them. Or, you know, they can't hold it. There's no point in doing it. And they also don't have the supplies to do so. Plus, the naval war is still ongoing. So the U.S. is not in a position to reoccupy it or attack it.
A reasonably significant naval operation. Is this the slide? Okay, I see now. This is what I was thinking of.
Yes. Add a little extra thing. I wanted to include that picture in there. But yes, I wanted to include a map of the Komandorsky Islands as well. So the U.S. actually does end up sending a couple task forces up to Alaska who their main goal is trying to maintain a blockade of Attu and Kiska. So they go west of Attu and start doing patrols for Japanese surface vessels trying to approach the islands to get supplies to them. There are relatively few direct engagements throughout the following almost year. Several U.S. submarines actually sink a couple Japanese destroyers and some Japanese transport vessels carrying supplies and reinforcements to Attu and Kiska. Several planes from the 11th Air Force also strike some of the vessels as well. And the U.S. actually, at the end of the day, or at the end of the campaign, lost 3 naval vessels throughout this entire campaign, which in the grand scheme of things is not a lot. This was by no means a major naval campaign, but it was important for these upcoming battles. The U.S. lost 2 submarines and a destroyer, 2 of which were sunk by accidentally grounding themselves when they were landing troops ashore at some of these islands. But the main battle that occurred on the naval front was the Battle of the Komandorsky Islands, which Komandorsky is Russian for commander, the Commander Islands. Oh. The Commander Islands are west of Attu and Kiska, and this battle occurred about halfway between the Commander Islands and Attu. So Rear Admiral Charles McMorris had a small task force. They're out on patrol. They're looking for Japanese forces. And he has with him 1 heavy cruiser, the USS Salt Lake City, a light cruiser, and 4 destroyers, a small destroyer task force, including the USS Bailey, which I'll talk about in a second. And he spots Admiral Hosagaya's task force, which includes 2 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, and several destroyers and smaller ships, plus several transport vessels. And so McMorris is outnumbered 2 to 1. He's going up against 2 heavy cruisers, which are, smaller battleships, but he recognizes they have transport vessels with them. He knows by this point in March 1943, the U.S. is going to land on Attu soon. He cannot let those transport vessels get through, so he actually charges the Japanese fleet. It's actually a 4-hour gun duel. They almost parallel with each other as they're going towards Attu, are trading shots back and forth. The USS Salt Lake City actually takes rather severe damage and loses power. It's dead in the water, and it looks like the U.S. is about to lose a heavy cruiser until the USS Bailey, a small destroyer, actually charges the Japanese fleet single-handedly and unleashes a couple salvos of torpedoes, which damage both Japanese heavy cruisers and one of their light cruisers as well. The USS Bailey was peppered with Japanese shell fire. It was severely damaged as well. And then just out of nowhere, Hosagaya actually pulls his force back and they retreat. They head back towards Japan. A lot of people have debated why he would do that, especially because it looked like he could have won that battle. But again, he was spotted by a U.S. fleet. He's heading towards Attu and Kiska with these transport vessels. He knows they likely reported it to the 11th Air Force or another U.S. task force in the area. He fears that if he's going towards Attu and Kiska, he's going to run into another American fleet or force down the road. And 3 of his largest ships are now damaged. So he's not willing to risk it. When he gets back to Japan, he's actually relieved of command for not delivering those supplies. And because he didn't deliver those supplies, the Japanese on Attu and Kiska, they are running out of food. They're running out of fuel for their few vehicles, their fuel sources, their resources, their fresh water. The troops on those islands, by the time the battles occur, are borderline starving.
Yeah.
So after this battle, Japan, what's interesting is the Japanese Navy is not in a position to get into attritional warfare with the U.S. Navy. They don't want to do that anymore.
There's a lot of naval battles going on further south.
That's right, and those are the important ones.
Yeah.
So although they relieved Hosagaya of command, they did look at it and recognize that he was probably right. That probably would not have gone well if he had kept steaming towards the island. So they actually abandoned all surface resupply missions to Attu and Kiska. It would only be done by submarine going forward, and submarines can only carry so much.
So I love the name of the actual operation they come up with. Remind me of the story. Why did they call it land crab?
So I'm not sure who came up with the actual operation name. From what I read, some genius up at probably the government level had the idea to name it Operation Land Grab. And a lot of people said that doesn't really sound right considering we're liberating American soil. So they called it Land Crab instead, which I think sounds better anyways.
Yeah.
So once you get to January of 1943, the American forces and the Aleutians are starting to shape up more. So Rear Admiral Thomas C. Kincaid actually is given overall command of the offensive operations in the Aleutian Island campaign. He is in command of the North Pacific Force, which includes all air units, ground units, naval units, and his task is taking back Attu and Kiska. When he came in, he actually said, instead of taking Kiska, we're going to take Attu. If we take Attu, we'll have Kiska almost completely surrounded. They're not going to get any supply vessels in, even submarines, and we could bomb it from all directions. And Attu's lightly defended. That's probably the smarter choice. Meanwhile, they start giving orders to the 7th Infantry Division to mobilize and go north towards Alaska, and they're the ones that are actually going to conduct the Battle of Attu, which I'll talk about on the next slide. But at the end of the day, he now has a substantial naval force. He has an infantry division that's about to take Attu. The 11th Air Force is doing some serious damage to the Japanese forces. They can't get supplies through, and the Japanese are not in a good position.
Just a quick story about Kincaid that you and I talked about, Alan, when you and I talked privately. If you recognize the name, if our audience recognizes the name, he was the predecessor to Admiral Hubble, who was the commander of U.S. naval forces at Pearl Harbor on December 7th. Kincaid had that job, but when FDR moved the fleet to Pearl Harbor in late 1940 or early 41, I've forgotten now in the exact date, whatever, doesn't matter. But when FDR said, yeah, we're going to base the U.S. Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor, Kincaid objected and actually went to Washington, D.C. and objected to it face-to-face to FDR. And so what did they do with him? They ship him off to Alaska, in the middle of nowhere, because, he had the audacity to object to his boss. And here he is in Alaska now running the show in Alaska. So another little twist of history.
Yeah, and that was one of the jokes we had in the Army too, because we didn't have the best upper leadership at Fort Wainwright, especially amongst the senior NCO Corps, because a lot of people go there because it's a cool duty station and they want to retire. So we always joked, they always send the terrible leaders or the terrible soldiers to Alaska to forget about them.
Yeah.
So yeah, even back then, that seems to be the case.
Standard joke in every movie too, shipping to
Right.
Alaska. So this now what becomes the 7th Infantry Division is assigned to carry out this task. And why the Hourglass Division, Alan? Do you know?
That's actually a good question. I actually do not remember off the top of my head why they were called the Hourglass Division. Oh man, that's a good question. Actually, I know I've read it before. Totally brain dumped it, but yeah. So they were selected to be the division to go take back Attu. Initially, General DeWitt, who's leading Western Defense Command, wanted to send the 35th Infantry Division, whose commanders actually had experience being stationed in Alaska or the Aleutian Islands. They had been activated a little bit longer and actually had a little bit more cold weather gear. However, someone up in the chain of command decided, no, we're sending the 7th Infantry Division. They get slotted, they go, and to maintain secrecy, I'm sure the military knows what it's doing, does not issue cold weather gear to the soldiers because they're worried they'll start writing home, I'm obviously going to Alaska, if they're given cold weather gear. So they were actually training in California to go to North Africa. And then at the last minute, they're shipped to Alaska with no cold weather gear.
Now, this is a fascinating part that you and I talked about that I had no idea about, and that's the Japanese commander's defense strategy. You want to explain that for us, Alan?
Yes, I can. I actually saw someone in the chat said the Hourglass Division, because its official shoulder patch from October 1918 features an hourglass shape formed by 2 inverted upright number 7s, symbolizes the division's numerical designation, the 7th, and goes back to World War I. So, yeah, I'm not familiar with the 7th Infantry Division aside from this right here and then their actions on Kwajalein, but it's fascinating for sure. So,
what you learn about our members, when you don't know something, there's always somebody who knows. They're a fascinating, highly educated audience.
Yep. So Yasuo Yamasaki he actually gets brought ashore at Attu in April of 1943, and they actually managed to sneak in roughly 2,500 Japanese soldiers to reoccupy the island. When he goes in, he decides, so by this point, Japan's still very much in the mindset of we hold the beach, we build bunkers along the shoreline, we do not let the Americans land. He comes ashore and says, I'm not doing that. I'm going up into the mountain ridges. We'll let the Americans get ashore. They can get all the supplies and men ashore they want. They're going to have to charge up these steep mountain cliffs in waist-high snow while we're shooting at them with zero visibility. They're going to make it difficult for the Americans. So even these Japanese soldiers here, you can see, are wearing heavy parkas and winter hats, and they're holding samurai swords because they're based on Attu during this time. And the Japanese on the island, for the most part, are from Hokkaido. They are actually used to mountain and Arctic or cold weather warfare. Meanwhile, the 7th Infantry Division is not given cold weather gear whatsoever. They have no idea what they're about to get into.
And the actual invasion takes place May of 43.
That's right. So they actually wanted to land on May 7th. They actually get the forces together, 7th IDs loaded up into the ships, and they get to Attu. However, the weather is so horrible. There's bad, they call them willowas, which are almost like hurricane force winds that come in and they can capsize ships, especially small transport vessels. There's bad fog. It's just ugly all around. So they wait 4 days for May 11th and then actually go ashore. Kincaid tells them, you're not waiting any longer, you're going ashore. I don't care what the weather's like. So they actually land in 3 places. So Kastner's Cutthroats with a scout battalion land at Beach Scarlet, which you can see at the top left corner right here. And they're not really going up against Japanese troops initially. They're more so kind of screening west of the landings to make sure there's no Japanese defenses on this side of the island. And after a couple of days, they meet up with the Northern Landing Force, which landed at Red Beach next to Holt's Bay, which was led by Colonel Frank L. Cullen Jr. They actually run into Japanese troops. They start taking fire from the other side of the bay. They start receiving fire from Japanese troops in the trenches. But the main landing force is actually in the south under Colonel Edward Palmer Earl, who's actually killed in action shortly after landing. He's replaced by Colonel Wayne C. Zimmerman. And if you look at the map, they're actually moving up a valley, which is flanked on both sides by these high mountains that Japanese troops are occupying. So the only way they can actually defeat the Japanese is going up the valley. You have one force that keeps going, but every now and again, you peel off forces to actually charge up the cliffs to silence Japanese guns and bunkers. And while they're charging up these cliff faces, which are terrible, and I can speak from experience trying to climb mountain cliffs like this, it's horrible. And they're being shot at by machine guns and snipers, and then the Japanese have mortars and artillery behind the mountain ridges actually firing on them. So over the next week, they actually struggle. The forces can't link up in the center. They're taking horrible casualties. They're losing men left and right to trench foot, frostbite, chilblain, hypothermia. Hundreds of men are going down from machine gun fire, snipers, as well as cold weather casualties. Major General Brown, Albert E. Brown, who's leading the division, is actually fired. He's relieved of command because Thomas Kincaid feels he's going too slow. And he is actually replaced by Major General Eugene Landrum, who was one of the commanders from the 35th Infantry Division, who probably should have been leading this in the first place, according to the leaders. But he ends up finding the same issues. His men still can't link up for another 48 days. So around May 17th and 18th, the Northern and Southern forces finally actually link up near above Holt's Bay. Colonel Cullen actually managed to break through the Japanese defenses there. And once he did and he got to the top of the ridge, he now saw the Southern forces. They linked up, and now the Japanese are boxed in around Fishhook Ridge and Chichikov Harbor, which is where the native village is. So at this point, they still have another ridge they have to cross, but it has not been an easy battle so far. And this is actually where one of the most heroic incidents of probably all of World War II occurs. So at this point, they actually bring in another regiment, the 4th Infantry Regiment, to reinforce, because the 2 infantry regiments fighting from the north and south struggled so much. They needed support to take Fishhook Ridge. So Company K from the 32nd Infantry gets pinned down while trying to advance into Fishhook Ridge. They're being hit from 2 different sides. They're being bracketed by mortars. It does not look good. This 22-year-old from Taos, New Mexico, Private Joseph P. Martinez, is a Browning automatic rifleman. He stands up in the middle of his men being pinned down in the open in the snow and just charges at the Japanese by himself, firing his BAR, and he silences several Japanese trenches and bunkers single-handedly. He's throwing grenades in the bunkers, he's clearing the trenches, and then he starts moving on to the next trench line. His company actually get up and charge with him, and they clear several more layers of defenses. Private Martinez was unfortunately shot in the head as he was clearing the very last Japanese trench, but his company managed to kill the Japanese that killed him. And once they broke through that final trench, the pass to Chichikov Harbor was open, and Fishhook Ridge had, for the most part, been taken. He was the first, so he was actually recommended for the Medal of Honor, and his parents received it in October of that year. He was the first Hispanic American to receive the award during World War II, and he's actually the only American to receive it in ground combat against an enemy force on North American soil since the Indian Wars.
Wow. So, what, again, what a courageous story, and, totally forgotten, right? Not only is the battle totally forgotten, this man's courage, not, remembered very often. And so we're very pleased that you told this story to us tonight.
And it's interesting because Medal of Honor recipients, it's always something like they were killed in action trying to save somebody, or they jumped on a grenade, or they did something heroic, or their action alone dictated the end of a battle or changed the outcome of a campaign. He was not only killed in action and did something amazingly heroic, but his lone action broke through the final Japanese defense line. And it was at this point, even the Japanese knew, we're done now. So he directly brought about the end of the Battle of Attu. So at this point, Yamasaki, who's leading the Japanese troops, he has about 800 men still in their foxhole, still pulling guard, still standing to fight. But they're trapped in a valley surrounded by American forces who are now pouring onto Fishhook Ridge. He has no hope of escape. Interestingly enough, the Japanese Navy is actually forming a relief fleet, hoping to break through the American naval blockade and save them. But by this point, even the Japanese leadership realized there's no hope for these gentlemen. We're going to leave them. So they pull back the fleet. There's no rescue coming. Yamasaki actually leads his 800 men in one of the largest banzai charges of the entire Pacific War. He has 800 men. Most banzai charges were only 200, 300, maybe up to 500 at most, maybe what's left of a battalion. 800 men's that's almost a full strength small battalion. The 600 wounded they have left, they make them kill themselves with hand grenades. And then the Japanese doctors, actually, including Dr. Paul Nibu Tatsuguchi, who actually wrote it in his diary, he wrote a document giving all of the survivors left in the hospital grenades to finish themselves off. So they actually targeted an American company from the 32nd Infantry. It was 3 a.m. They were going to get hot chow. They were not expecting a Japanese attack. They left some sentries up on the hill. The Japanese actually overran them, got into the rear supply areas, and started engaging engineers, supply troops, medics, cooks with samurai swords. And these troops had to defend themselves with pistols, e-tools, whatever they can get their hands on. And their goal was to reach Engineer Hill, which had the American 105 millimeter artillery cannons on it. As they actually get to the hill, the American engineers based there, the 50th Engineers, actually managed to break up the attack. And with that, the Japanese that are left standing kill themselves, or about 200 of them actually managed to make it through and escape to Western Attu, and they continue resisting for the next couple months, for the rest of the summer. But Yamasaki and Tatsuguchi are both killed during this banzai charge.
And the cost. Let's after this, we'll take a break.
Yep. So the cost is very rough for both sides. So the Japanese lose, according to the count, the official count is 2,351. That's what the Americans found and buried on the island. They actually take 28 prisoners. Most of those were knocked unconscious or knocked out during the banzai charge and were taken against their will. Of the 200 that escaped West Attu, a lot of them were killed in firefights or skirmishes over the summer. In fact, this picture on the right is probably one of the pictures you'll see if you ever talk about Attu elsewhere, or see the battle mentioned elsewhere. This battle was actually taken months after the end of the battle at the end of May. So they're still actively engaging Japanese troops on the island. So over 99% of the Japanese on the island are killed. The Americans lose 549 killed in action. They lose 1,148 wounded, but this is unlike any other Pacific War battle. They lose 2,100 to frostbite, trench foot, hypothermia, environmental casualties. There's no other battle in the entire Pacific War where the battle casualties, including the KIA, are dwarfed by the environment. And that is so that's actually what led to the Army deciding to create better cold weather systems, better mittens, better boots, and a lot of those inventions that came out from this battle, the Army uses in Alaska today.
Okay, let's stop for a moment. We're getting towards the end of the program, but let's field some questions. Maybe let me start with Joe McCarthy. Joe, we mentioned earlier, let me ask you to unmute. Your father-in-law served in the Aleutian Islands. What was his name and where did he serve?
Yes, Alan, thank you for a wonderful presentation. This is really fascinating. My late father-in-law was a petty officer in the Navy. Herman Hohenadel was his name. And he served on Kodiak Island, which isn't per se part of the Aleutians, but it's pretty darn close. His job was to train seamen for survival training, hand-to-hand combat, how to survive in the water, swimming through burning oil, things like that. So he was at the Kodiak Naval Operations Base and the air station during the war, and that was what I've read, the base for the Catalina patrol boats, submarines, intelligence, kind of supported the operations that were due west of Kodiak Island. Interesting, what I've read is it was never bombed, but not because the Japanese didn't want to. It was shrouded in fog almost like 9 out of 10 days, and they didn't feel it was worth attacking because of the chances they would run into a mountain or just lose navigation. So he was fortunate, I guess, to be that part of the war in that particular island.
Thank you, Joe.
Sure.
Always nice to make a connection.
Thank you.
Are there other questions, other comments?
Brad asked, didn't the Canadians have troops in the campaign?
I'm about to talk about them here in a second. They're on one of the next slides.
And Verna asked, do you have information on what our troops may have done in Shemya during the campaign, 42-44, when my father was there?
I'm actually not familiar with that. I'm assuming that's one of the islands in the Aleutian chain. There were troops on a lot of these. There were 300 plus, and there were airfields, supply bases, all kinds of things on a lot of them. So it would be hard to say. I personally don't know what happened on that particular one.
And Jeff Patton, you raised your hand?
Yeah, you can hear me now. Okay.
Yep.
So I had a great uncle that was in World War II, and he was in the Aleutians before he was in the European theater. So I have his discharge paperwork, and I know he was there from July of 43 until February of 44, but I don't know anything about it, his tour, his location, his unit. I know he was in the 87th when he went to Europe. So how do we find that type of information if we're looking into the Aleutian history?
One of the best things you could do is reach out to the National Archives. And if you have some of his information, like his social security number, birth dates, things like that, they could actually hopefully provide you with his entire service file, and it will have the dates of his service, where he was at, campaigns he participated in, everything that the Army collected from him or the military collected from him during that time. That's your best bet.
Jeff, I'd add, I don't see Beth Ruschel on the program tonight. Do you see her, Sean?
No, but you took the words right out of my mouth. Go ahead, Glenn.
Beth is now actually working with us at the Veterans Breakfast Club, and she is undoubtedly the world's best World War II researcher. She's done some great research for us. She did some personal work for my family. And, a lot of people, Jeff, say, well, you can't find these documents because of the famous fire that took place out in St. Louis in 79, I think it was. She has many, many workarounds for that. So, Jeff, I know you have my email. If you'd like to talk to Beth Ruschel, just shoot me an email. I'll put you in touch with her. I thought there was an interesting comment here by, is Bill Boswell? Bill, where are you? Let's unmute Bill. Because it's the same question I ask over and over about a lot of the Pacific campaign, Bill. Is he still there? Sean, I don't.
Yeah. I'll unmute you, Bill. If you're there. Go ahead, Bill.
I'm here.
So
I'm here.
State your comment and I'll expand on it because I have the same.
Well, go ahead and read it.
Well, one wonders whether it would have been better to interdict Japanese supplies and then just let the troops on the island starve. Political reasons likely, but we did not. We did that with island hopping later in the war. Yeah, we island hopped, but there were so many Pacific Island campaigns where, take a Peleliu, where, we defeated the Japanese in the first few weeks of the battle at terrible cost to us. And then we took just as many casualties in the last couple of weeks of the battle, getting them out of the northern ridges of that island. And I've always thought to myself, well, why don't we just and bomb them to death from the air and artillery and let them starve to death rather than sacrifice another 1,000 men or whatever it was at the time? And you can ask that question about quite a few Pacific Island battles.
You could, and the reason I bring it up here is the conditions there were so horrific. The only thing that comes to mind is it was U.S. territory, and politically it would have been impossible to ignore, unlike the islands in the Pacific, which were not.
Well, that's part of it for sure, probably the main reason, but those Japanese troops on those islands did have airplanes. They had a couple recon planes, they had a couple fighters, there was a submarine base there. And they were going out and landing on some of these other islands on occasion. So the US military was concerned that, yes, you could leave them there, but submarines could still drop supplies and troops off on those islands. So they would still be a thorn in the side of the US military and the Aleutians if they were just left there. So that's another reason they decided to take the islands.
Okay. Chase, comment or question? I'll unmute you.
I just wanted to point out, I posted somewhere in the chat, there's this really good reenactment group. They do all events all over the United States, but they mostly focus on Japanese, and they did one of the videos, little short thing on the winter kit of the Japanese forces in the Arctic. And just looking at that, and then, knowing that the Americans didn't have winter gear. Obviously, there's no reports on it, but I would just wonder how many guys just ended up stealing boots or stealing the thick fur coats off of some of the guys. Just
Alan, any comment, any thought there?
I don't know specifically. I definitely don't know how often that happened, but the troops for the most part had to kind of make do for themselves, and they started using non-authorized ways to warm themselves, like maybe wearing a couple layers of socks, or maybe wearing a couple layers of gloves that they stole from some rear supply troops, or even take stuff from dead Japanese troops on occasion. One of the main things they did on the island to try to keep warm was actually have constant fires lit all the time, and that obviously attracted Japanese fire, but it was almost unavoidable. And that's part of the reason why casualties were so high on this island. They were just not ready for the cold weather whatsoever. And that's another reason the military turned around and said, we can't let this happen again.
Sean, do we want to take a real quick station break to let people know what's coming up next week?
Absolutely. Real quick here, just want to let everybody know that VBC Magazine, this should be hitting your mailboxes soon. It's a great issue. It's a free quarterly magazine. So if you don't get it, please send us your address. We're happy to add you to our mailing list. Next week, we have several programs sort of lined up throughout the week, but it's a little different in the sense that Monday night, we're going to have on Doug Bradley, and he's going to talk about his book, The Tracks of Our Years. We're talking about music during the Vietnam War. We're not going to be live streaming on YouTube or Facebook. Why? Because if we play any other music, we get flagged, so we don't want that to happen. But expect to come in the Zoom room on Monday night and hear some great music, because we're going to play some stuff that night. And we want to hear everybody's thoughts about the music during that time. Doug, obviously an expert in his own right, and Don Nemchek's going to be hosting that program, also an expert. So I'm really looking forward to it. We have a great playlist lined up. Should be a lot of fun. I know that Tuesday night, we're going to be meeting on Zoom to discuss the Santa Monica trip. And then later in the week, we're going to have on we're making sort of a new program. We're gonna take over Glenn's spot for a night. We're calling it VBC After Dark. This is a registration-only program. It's only on Zoom, again, not live streamed on YouTube or Facebook. But we made it this way because it's going to be maybe a little bit more adult in our veteran stories. All the stories that we may not hear about, or maybe loosen up the top button a little bit. If you're easily offended, I would say probably avoid this one for us, but it's an After Dark program. So if you're interested in checking it out, Marine veteran Michael D'Angelo is going to be joining us to talk about his story, and also hear probably a bunch of stories. We'll probably have a little bit more open conversation that night as well. So don't join us on social medias next week. Join us in the Zoom room. Otherwise, back to you, Glenn.
You have a slide on the Wednesday night program on the Italy.
I knew I was forgetting one. We're on 4 nights next week. So Wednesday night, we're going to be talking about the Italy program, the Italy trip that we're going to be taking later this year. So you can join us Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday night. I think Tuesday and Wednesday will be live streamed if you can't join us on Zoom.
And Wednesday focuses not just on the trip, but also the bombing of Monte Cassino, which is going to be part of our trip. And the anniversary of the bombing of Monte Cassino is, I think, February 15th. So we'll miss that by a few days, but tragic event in so many ways. So we thought we would feature that. We're also going to be talking about the actual troops that took the Abbey. The Monte Cassino were Polish troops. It was a Polish division. And there's a famous story about Wojciech the Bear. And we're going to have Colin Heaton and Marilyn Walton on to tell us about Wojciech the Bear, because they are part of a group of people that have made a documentary that's coming out soon about Wojciech the bear, who was with these Polish troops. And it's just really kind of a fascinating, different kind of topic relative to World War II. Okay, let's bring this home, Alan, if we could. I know we've got several more slides, Alan, but we're probably ought to just hit, I think, sort of your ending slide, if you will, and that's about the people of Attu. Is that okay,
Yeah,
Alan?
that's completely. I was going to say Kiska was also liberated shortly after Attu was, and there were no Japanese on the island. They actually evacuated the garrison under the cover of fog, and when the Americans and Canadians went ashore, they ran into booby traps and ended up shooting at each other in the fog, and they lost about 300 soldiers in the process, and there were no Japanese troops on the island. But once the war actually came to an end, the Attuan civilians that were sent to Japan were put in Hokkaido, and they were forced to mine for clay and other minerals like that in horrible conditions. Etta Jones, the wife of Charles Jones, who was executed, was sent to live with some Australian nurses, and she ended up surviving the war. But of the 41 civilians, 22 of them died, including a lot of children. Mike Hodikoff, who I mentioned earlier, that stopped the potential massacre, him and his son died of malnutrition during this time. There were 19 survivors that were actually freed from captivity and brought back. While most of the Aleutian civilians were allowed to return to their homes and rebuild their villages with the U.S. government's assistance after the war, the Attuans were told, "You're not ever going home." It was now a U.S. military installation. It was too costly, and the government felt, why are we going to rebuild a village for just 19 people? So their village that had, in essence, been there for 10,000 years was completely destroyed along with its culture from this war. And then the Golodov family, I didn't get to talk about them too much, but the youngest one of them was actually 3 when he was captured on Attu Island. He was 6 when he was liberated. He passed away at the age of 84 in November of 2023. He was the last native Attuan who spoke the language and was born on the island. So to this day, there's no native speakers of their dialect and no one that was born on the island. But some of their grandkids, including Helena Gano, who's Chief Hodikoff's great-granddaughter, leads Addicts Forever, trying to maintain their culture and teach the language to this day.
Wow. Wow. Well, war and its devastation, right? Yeah. Let's see what else. I know the legacy. Here's maybe make this the last slide for your comments, Alan.
Yep, that was the last slide right there. The only thing I was going to say with that, I already mentioned it earlier today. It's a National Historic Landmark. You can still visit those islands. This is actually one of the Japanese AA cannons on Kiska Island overlooking the bay. And when you look at the ratio, the only other thing I was going to say too was 71 Americans were killed for every 100 Japanese that were killed on the island, or casualties, I'm sorry, killed and wounded Americans versus killed Japanese, most of them were killed, which is actually only surpassed when you look at the ratio by Iwo Jima. Iwo Jima is the only battle of the Pacific War where American casualties outnumbered the Japanese casualties. That's because the U.S. lost 26,000 troops killed or wounded on Iwo Jima versus only 21,000 Japanese troops on the island. But if you include the non-battle casualties of Attu in the total, so over 3,000 Americans killed or wounded, it is actually one of only 2 battles of the Pacific War where the U.S. lost more troops than the Japanese did. And today, most people don't know about this battle. But these battles are part of the reason that Alaska was able to apply for and was granted statehood in 1959. A lot of delegates from the state went on to fight vigorously for statehood based on the experiences the state faced during the war.
Yeah. Wow. Again, your title of this last slide is absolutely appropriate, The Forgotten Battle, and the impact that it had, the courage, the man Martinez there who won the who was a recipient of the Medal of Honor. I almost slipped up, Brad. Brad, I saw you shaking your head as soon as I started to say that. It's part of our mission is to recall these forgotten or little known battles and the sacrifices that were made by so many people to fight these wars. So, Alan, thank you so very much for being
Of
here.
course.
Do that.
I appreciate y'all having me.
Yeah, thank you. We'll give you any last minute comments. We're 5 minutes past the witching hour. Does anybody got anything profound they'd like to ask? Russell Freeberg, as always, it's a pleasure to have you on, sir. Thank you. And Scott is already working on the chocolate cake that he's going to bake for you, right, Scott? Oh, I see one hand up. Patrick Hughes. Or was that just an applaud? That was an applaud. Okay. Well, we'll be done for the night. Thank you all for being part of the program.
Oh, sorry, Gilbert. Gilbert had his hand raised. Go ahead, Gilbert.
Yeah, clarify something. I served in the 7th Infantry Division, not in Attu, but it's called somewhat jokingly the Crushed Beer Can Division, which is the same shape as the patch, but it's officially the Bayonet Division. Originally was the Hourglass Division. For whatever reason, I have no idea. And by the way, Alan, I've got a lot of pictures and a lot of information on Attu, especially the Navy PV1s and PV2s attacking Paramashiro. In fact, I'll flip here for a second if I can and even show you a picture of, well, I can't do that.
Yeah, you can't, Gilbert. So
okay,
we'd be happy to put you in touch with Alan, Gilbert.
Perfect.
You have my email. I'll put you in touch with Alan, and you two.
Thanks very much, Glenn.
Oh, wait, and Russell Freeberg raised his hand.
Oh, Russell.
Were there any war correspondents that covered the battles in Alaska?
There was one very famous one named Robert Sherrod, who actually went ashore with the Army and witnessed the horrible conditions that they fought in. And then he later went ashore with the Marines in several engagements, and he was very slanted in favor of the Marine Corps. So he always talked about, especially on Saipan, he covered General Smith firing the Army General Smith during the battle and basically said the Marine Corps is doing a way better job on this island than the Army. His experiences on Attu are covered in, if you've ever seen the TV series World War II in HD, he's one of the 10 veterans or witnesses of World War II whose experiences are the show, that are put into the show. But he worked for Time magazine during World War II.
Anything written by Robert Sherrard about World War II is a fascinating read.
Yes.
I don't know it's officially, but I'm guessing he was participated in more invasions than any actual military combat man in the Pacific. He was everywhere.
Interestingly enough, he actually said Attu was one of the worst things he ever experienced and one of the worst things he could see somebody experiencing. And even Howland Mad Smith, the famous Marine Corps general who did not like the Army, he actually observed the battle, and he later said that was the worst amphibious assault, like what the men endured. It was one of the most tragic things he had ever witnessed. So even someone who is very slanted against the Army acknowledged that was a tough fight.
Yeah. Okay, we will call it a night. Alan, one more time, thank you. Russell, thank you so much for being part of our programs. Alan, please don't be a stranger. We'd like to hear more from you and have you on future programs.
Of course, I'll be around. Looking